fantastic. And got it.
Cool. So today we're discussing title belts, championships, and the champions who hold them.
The lineage of championship title belts.
Yeah, all the way up to things you can buy on eBay.
Or them still them meaning the pro wrestling still debuting belts to this day. Let me get my marbles out of my mouth here.
All right. So the first thing that I think of when we think about title belts is the big three belt makers. But before we kind of dash into that, when did we start to see championships in wrestling? I know boxing and wrestling have a lot of parallels, but when did we start to see championships become prominent in professional wrestling?
As early as professional wrestling has existed. We're talking the early 1900s. The first world heavyweight champion on record is George Hackenschmidt. Won the world title in the catch version of the world title in 1905. So that he would be about the first, and then the first man to popularize it and who actually beat him for the world title was Frank Gotch, and that happened in 1908, and he held the title until 1913. So the lineage dates way back, but I would have to say while Hackenschmidt was the first, I think Gotch and it's documented had popularized wrestling in the United States as we know it today. Now, back then, it was still a shoot.
It sure was, like 6-hour matches. And
yes, so it didn't become a work. And if you want to find out how it all became a work per se, there's a great book by Marcus Griffin called Fall Guys, which you can buy off of Crowbar Press, and it actually details the entire history of how wrestling became from a work to as we know it now, in modern pro wrestling.
Yeah, so, from what I understand is that you would have a catch-all wrestler, very much a shoot style wrestler, and if there wasn't anybody who could beat them, or if they could confidently destroy everybody, that's fun for a little while, but you're not going to draw as many people when they come in if it's a foregone conclusion that this guy's just going to win. And so from my understanding, they started introducing the idea of, I don't know, you don't want to say fake because that's not entirely accurate, but worked title changes and things like that to kind of draw attention to the champions and to the promotion.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And wrestling, going back to the work, would have to becoming a work, would have to actually go back to carnival wrestling, because they would always have in the carnivals, they would have all the attractions, the freak shows, the strongmen, the bearded lady, all that stuff. But they would always have a strongman / wrestler who, okay, if you last 2 minutes with this guy, you get the prize money, of course. And nobody got the prize money because, well, the ring was 3-sided and there was a big sheet. And usually if an audience member got a little salty with the seasoned pro, there was a guy waiting in the wings with like a weapon of some sort. Usually it was a blackjack, and would whack the guy right in the head, and boom, there you go. So, suffice it to say, nobody really collected the prize money, but the better ones that actually would go the distance, of course the circus would recruit, and then they would just continue the process all the way up until they would get involved in some sort of organized professional wrestling
Yeah.
uh,
And
facet.
the traveling carnival business model was very much adopted into the earliest promotions, worked promotions to travel around even today. The
Yeah.
WWE travels around going from town to town, and that really is the adopted carnival model, isn't it?
Yeah, and instead of rail cars, you have 18 wheelers with hauling the rings and the lights and the sets and everything. Like it's pretty much the same thing. Like, and people, it's amazing how many people don't see the correlation between the two, but I see it 100%. Especially if I watch some. I mean, I just watched on HBO Max. I watched a movie called Nightmare Alley, and I'm watching that because that's all about the carnival freak show and a guy basically finding a mark and working the crowd. And I'm like, dude, this is pro wrestling through and through. I just can't stop making the correlation between the two. You know what I mean? And Bradley Cooper's in it, and Bradley Cooper's a fantastic actor. Actually,
Yes, he is.
he has something to do with that production on the Hulk Hogan biopic that's supposed to be coming out, which Eric Bischoff is executive producing, and I do believe Chris Helmsworth. Yeah, Chris Helmsworth. I'm saying his name right.
Chris
Uh,
Hemsworth.
yes, yeah. He's going to be portraying Hogan. What era of Hogan, I don't know, but I know he's tapped to portray Hogan. He's packed on the muscle mass and everything.
That's
So
actually a pretty good choice.
yeah, I mean, maybe they might be a little generous with the hair. I don't know, but
And I'm sure they have some kind of fitted cap or wig to give him the big skullet.
I tell you what, like I said, only Hulk Hogan and Terry Bradshaw can rock that hairstyle. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I can't imagine that hairstyle on anybody but those two men. I
Paulie.
really can't. Huh?
Paulie.
Yeah, but like I had said, he looks
He
like
always
Alfred.
wore a hat, though.
Yeah, and he looks like Alfred Hitchcock now. So I mean, I can't. Sorry, Cornette got into my head, and I can't get it out of my head now. Like literally, when he walks out, I just think Hitchcock.
All right. So, without diving too deep into when the business transitioned from a shoot to a work, when did we start to see territories or promotions have firm roots in an area, still adopting the traveling carnival business model, where they had a traveling champion?
That happened around the early 50s, actually late 40s, early 50s, because the NWA as we know it, was formed in 1948. And but it wasn't until 1952 where Lou Thez wins his first world title, where Thez was basically the recognized NWA champion. Actually, Thez unified three world titles to become the undisputed champion. The catch version and whatever other version there was. It's escaping me now, but I do know for a fact that Fez unified, because I have his book. He unified three titles,
Was that
and
from three different promotions?
three different, like not three different promotions, but from the record, the lineage traces back to Hackenschmidt. So it's like the three errors, the two previous errors before Fez. So,
Okay.
and you know, basically that was recognized as like the undisputed champion and the NWA traveling champion. And Fez, of course, when he was a much younger man, he was sent around the territories and as the traveling champion, and Fez took on all comers. So
Yeah. So you have the traveling champion, and I know the NWA is going to be very prominently discussed today about that. At at this point, you have Thez who unified some titles and he's starting to tour. When did a championship committee come into effect?
um you're talking the NWA Championship Committee, right?
Yeah, sure.
Probably as early as when Thez got the title. It was their decision to put the title on Thez. So it's while Thez had the credentials in the background to obtain it, you know, in a catch style, Thez was kind of like the last remnant of the catch. You know what I mean? Like that old style catch wrestler
Mhm.
into the modern era as we know it wrestler. You know, because that's how Thez broke in. Now wrestling very much by the early 50s was very much it was work by then. So it's and they were depending on what region of the country they were already on television. So
Yeah.
um, you know, because the 1950s, that's when everything changed. When television came around, everything changed, and Thez was a big part of it. So
Yeah. So what was you have the National Wrestling Alliance, and I think alliance is a really good term to use to describe how the different territories and different promotions were teamed up. Why did they even bother having a traveling champion though? And what kind of business relationship um, did the promotions or territories have with each other? Can you kind of break down the model of the traveling champion for the NWA and the different territories?
well, the purpose of the traveling champion, and it went all the way up to when Ric Flair was one of the last to do it. Um, each traveling champion would go into all the different territories, make a deal with all, well, through the NWA, they would make a deal with all the different promoters to send their traveling champion to get the gates to where they want to be, facing their local challengers. Again, very much carnival style, and putting over the local challengers, but in a way where they do not, well, they don't diminish the credibility of, you know, that territory's top guy, and also keep the world champion good. So usually, a the model was they would either give the guy a win so that way they can come back, the champion can come back. Like say they would have a non-title a contest, right? And then you can say, oh well, your local guy beat the world champion, and the local guy demands a rematch for that world title. You know, like because he was good enough to beat the world champion in a non-title match.
Yeah.
So of course they would come back, and the world champion would, you know, depending on how long they can keep that going, the world champion would always remain victorious in the end, or there would be like schmaz finish or something to that extent. But it was always to where uh, both parties went better than, you know, when they started, and the
Yeah.
business was very healthy at that time.
Yeah.
So it financially and mutually benefited everyone involved by this traveling champion model. Now, where I saw it mainly through tape trading was Flair, because Flair was, like I said, he was one of the last guys to do it, and Flair went everywhere with that traveling belt. He went to different countries too.
Mhm.
Sometimes he had said just as recently as his podcast, he sometimes didn't think he was going to get out of the territory with the title. So
Yeah.
that's where they would send like because by that time, of course, it become very cutthroat. So that's where they would send Harley with him, for example, or Murdoch with him, for example, or Piper with him in Puerto Rico, for example. So
Yeah.
that way he actually got out alive and with the world title belt, because he did, you know, at that point they didn't know. So
Yeah. And
but
and
when Fez did it, there were there's always been those backdoor politics in wrestling, but it was less. Does that make sense?
yeah. Well, and is this where we get the invent of the champion's advantage, where there are certain ways a champion can lose a match and keep the title?
Yes, it was. I don't want to say it was the dusty finish, but it kind of was in a way. Um, it was a it was like almost a spin-off of that Dusty. Well, the Dusty Finish idea actually came from Eddie Graham. So I mean, and where Eddie Graham got it from, one only knows.
Yeah,
Uh, but yeah, it's mostly known as the Dusty Finish, where the challenger would beat the world champion 1, 2, 3, but the referee was knocked out after that other. Well, the referee gets knocked out, then the other referee comes in after something shady takes place. 1, 2, 3, big pop, and then the original referee claims to have seen something shady went down before he got popped,
yeah,
therefore reversing the decision. It was their version of letting the fans go home happy. However, they probably went home twice as pissed, knowing that, hey, we thought we saw a world champion, but all of a sudden here's Ric Flair on TBS television saying that never happened.
yeah.
So what happened? Like that had to have been confusing.
What about how you can win by like a disqualification or win by count out or time limit draw, but you don't get the championship? Didn't that become a really popular model to
Yes.
build up matches without unseating the champion?
Yes, and that also carried over in WWF, with the exception of the whole throwing over the top rope with the disqualification thing. Which, in my mind, I didn't know what that was until I watched NWA for the first time when I was a little kid. Never got it. I was like, okay, so you mean you throw the guy over the top rope and all of a sudden you're disqualified? Like, I don't get it. You know what I mean? I guess it was a different set of rules, because I'm
Yeah,
used to WWF. People throw people over the top rope all the time. I think Berserker had that as a finishing move, didn't he? Where he just threw him over and the guy just had a 10 count. That was his finishing move. You just throw a guy over the top rope.
yeah. I know by the time we started watching wrestling, well, I mean, at least for me, being mostly exposed to the WWF, um, that Bill Watts style of uh, matchmaking, um, what I really wasn't familiar with that,
Oh,
where you got disqualified. That was I know 80s and 90s WCW NWA rules, wasn't it?
yes. I think.
Well,
Hang on. Can you put this on pause for 2 seconds?
all right. So we were discussing the champion's advantage, and yeah, I was curious when you started to see those stipulations in matches, because it seems to me that that would be a very popular way to put over a local guy with a championship on the line, but not upset the status quo. Um, by dethroning and uh, kind of knocking down the status of the world champion.
Yeah, and I hate to keep using Flair as an example, but
He's a good one.
he's a great example, and he's, in my opinion, he's my world heavyweight champion. You know what I mean? When I think of traveling world champions, Flair would say it would take it depended on the territory, it would take the right opponent, because he would have some god awful opponents that he dreaded going through a 60-minute Broadway with.
Yeah,
So it had to have been the right opponent, and an opponent you would think would beat the world champion that was a top guy in their territory. You know,
yeah,
like him and Kerry. That was always a good example, because Kerry physically looked like he can beat Flair at any time. You
yeah,
know, and or like if you went to Mid South, for example, very young Terry Taylor, young up and coming, handsome, good looking guy going against the established world champion. You would root for Terry, because at the time he was young, good looking rookie, and he looked like maybe, just maybe, he'd have a chance. Like, what if? It was a good what if scenario. So those are two really good examples I can think of right off the top of my head
yeah,
that are great, and both of them pop business in both territories. So
yeah. How come people didn't kind of get wise to this model that they used. I mean, even back in the day when you didn't have the internet, it it just seemed that that always going on. um, every time Flair would drop into someone's territory, and maybe it's just my inner jaded Mark. Um, how are they able to get away with that for so long?
They had like kind of an agreement with uh, like, well, back then, well, first of all, you hit the nail right on the head. There was no internet, so it wasn't like, but there were uh it, like magazines, of course. The After mags very much still existed back then in the Stanley Weston publications, and those publications would have deals with the promoters 9 times out of 10 to not publish certain things, and or they've gotten in trouble for publishing certain things. Like, for example, right off the top of my head, Harley Race body slamming Andre the Giant was not a good look. But good look in the arena, but not a good look on your magazine cover. Or Jerry Lawler beating Andre the Giant was not a good look. Like,
Yeah.
I think the headline read like "Midget beats Andre the Giant" or something, and it was it was Lawler.
Yeah, I have read about that.
Yeah, it was something to that extent, but it was kind of like a I'm not sure if it was an outward agreement or a silent agreement as to not a lot of those magazines back then kind of they were kayfabe even, you know what I mean? Like, so they would treat wrestling with a lot of respect, but you always have like those one or two guys that would kind of go off script, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Well, and so you had mentioned earlier when they had the traveling champion, they would send people like Harley Race or Roddy Piper with them. Most wrestling fans today, I imagine every wrestling fan today, is familiar with the Montreal Screwjob. Back in the time that you're talking about, though, there were times where they would try to hook and crook the world title from the champion without there being an agreement from everybody that this is what's supposed to go on. Did that happen quite a bit back then?
Only see, and those examples that I listed were, like where they sent Murdoch or they sent Harley was mainly Japan, where they actually still treated it like a shoot, and they still very much to this day do the same thing, treat it very shoot style. Um, so, and those Japanese wrestlers are double tough, and they can take anybody at any time. So, um, I think Flair made the right call by assigning Harley and or Murdoch to go with him, like to kind of straighten these guys out if they got out of line. But
Yeah.
um, he would always have a physical match, but 9 times out of 10 that wouldn't happen. The in the case of Harley or Dick, they would kind of bitch at Flair, that they had to stand outside for 45 to 60 minutes
Yeah.
or 90 minutes in certain cases. So, and same thing in Puerto Rico too. It was always the countries with the language barrier that people had a problem with. Or like, say for example, like I know in the AWA, Billy Robinson got a lot of flack for being like just being an unruly hooker and shooter or whatever. And yeah, well, he had some world title matches with Verne, and they drew a lot of money. Billy Robinson was not very well liked by his peers for that specific reason, and he kind of took cheap shots where it was unnecessary in that aspect. And
Mhm.
but guys, there was very few cases is my point. I'm digressing, but very very few cases or very few instances where that would happen. But when you were the NWA World Champion, I mean, you always had to have your guard up because you never knew. You just never knew.
Yeah. Were there any really famous instances where the NWA champion would travel to some little territory and they try to Montreal the title off them.
Oh, that's that's instances like that have always happened all the time, and or they would bring the NWA champion in, and the crowd wouldn't, like, let's just say they wouldn't give the champion a good opponent and the crowd wouldn't be there, and the promoter would look at the world champion like it was his fault that he didn't draw the crowd.
Yeah.
And that's where the world champion would be like, no, it's the opponent. You have to have a well-built opponent for me to come in. You can't just, or they would do a bait and switch at the last minute. They would use the whole card subject to change thing,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
where they would have a guy already in place, and then that guy mysteriously either got ill or something happened and then they would just stick a guy in there, and it wouldn't do as well. It, it really honestly, it was a case by case basis, but I think okay, so when Harley was world champion, Harley was tough enough to take on anybody and took no shit from anybody.
Yeah.
So I can't really see too many people pulling it on Harley. Same with your Dory Funk, for example, a legitimate shooter and a great wrestler, but also a nice guy, and he had good relationships with the people in territory. So,
Yeah.
but if they ever did go off script, I couldn't see anybody taking him, or Jack Briscoe even, who was legitimate
Oh yeah.
legitimate of a wrestler as you can get.
Yeah.
Flair was more, while Flair had an amateur background, Flair was a more reasonable businessman, and he just did anything to make the match good.
Yeah.
And that could have been to his detriment sometimes, meaning like, you go in there and you're putting over, say, Joe Blow from whoever, and the Joe Blow from whoever doesn't want to go 60 minutes. They want to go 45. And then all of a sudden they go to the promoter, no, that's still too long. I want to go 30. And that's where a guy like Flair, as nice as he was and wanting to do business, probably would have to step in and say, nah, you're doing a 45 to 60-minute match. This is what I came in for,
Yeah.
But again, a lot of those guys were protected by what of the alliance there was. The alliance more existed when your Briscoes and Harleys and Dorys and all those guys I mentioned were more prominent as world champions. But by the time Flair got in, the alliance was going away because Vince was becoming a thing, and it became a point where Jim Crockett was the alliance.
Yeah. So television, more dutiful wrestling magazine publications, for a while, I would imagine that was a really good way to make the traveling champion more prominent. You start to have interviews, and some of the major events have a lot of promotion in them. And the only problem with that is, well, like you said, you have Vince coming in, getting rid of all the territories, buying everything and everyone up. But then you start to see the traveling champion. So I think Flair is a great example of that, where what I guess what I'm trying to ask, in a very not clear way, is for all of the good that would do for promotion, television and more media. Was there a time where it was like a noticeable downfall? Like, hey, they had the same exact match 6 months ago, and everybody kind of has access to it. Like what harm did this do aside from the good? I guess I'm trying to ask.
By having the same match as the traveling champion,
Yeah.
It where television started to become really predominant, I think, where you were able to broadcast more. I wouldn't put the blame solely on Vince. However, it became oversaturated because of Vince. Yes, you know what I mean. He had to do that in order to get where WWF needed to be. But
Yeah.
Vince's business model was completely different than Crockett's. But once Crockett started buying, like in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, started buying up all these territories and getting their television time slots and then getting syndication of their own, that's when that business model really became flawed because they would always, you know what I mean? They would show, and Flair, unlike Hogan, Flair was an attraction, but he wasn't treated like the attraction Hogan was, if you notice. Because Hogan, if you notice, did not wrestle on television all that much. Hogan was more, he wrestled on television some, but he was, when he became WWF World Champion that first time around, he was more treated as a big attraction, a big gate, and television was used for promos for Hulk,
Yeah.
maybe a squash match here and there, maybe, and you would have to pay to see Hulk at the house shows,
Yeah.
and that was the attraction, that was the draw, and the caveat was Hogan was world champion. So you had a double, you know what I mean? Talk about your brain exploding,
Yeah. And like
Whereas,
the shows that were broadcast on TV or through closed circuit television, those are just pretty much like 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 fancy commercials for what
yes,
they're
yes,
selling at the gate, kind of like how in the 80s, the G.I. Joe cartoon was just a long commercial to get kids to buy toys. Wasn't that
yep,
how the
same
WWF model was?
same business model. You hit the nail right on the head. And where this is where the traveling champion thing, and I keep bringing Flair up, but it has to be said, where it was a detriment to him was he was on television too much defending the belt, because here he was putting on like a clinic against a guy like a George South who was a lifelong NWA jobber, right? He's putting on the same match he would put on with like Ricky Steamboat or anybody else he would be in the ring with, right? And or like Flair versus Bobby Eaton, which Bobby Eaton, don't, no disrespect to Bobby Eaton, he was one of the greatest in the ring, but Bobby Eaton was not treated like, say, a Lex Luger was in terms of attraction, So if Flair can barely beat Bobby Eaton, Flair can barely beat George South, which, and by the way, George South, great hand also, in great wrestling for his day. He did jobs both in WWF and WCW back in the day and was great. Barry Horowitz level's great, in my opinion. Can work with anybody. But when Flair's putting on those kind of matches on the Superstation, that was to his detriment because then it made him look less than. And you never saw Hogan do something like that. Hogan was always protected like that.
Yeah.
That was the big difference. And that's when that business model, the old NWA business model, the wheels started to fall off. So
Yeah.
when Flair got overexposed on television, like just like that, and then the dusty finishes coming in, that did not help his case as far as being an attraction. However, he always had name value because of his exposure. So it was a weird dichotomy with Flair,
Yeah.
But that's why, in my opinion, that was part of WWF's success as to reach where they reached, was because they were very careful to protect Hogan and
Yeah.
protect the world title.
So staying in this time period, yeah, probably early to mid 80s, where Hogan first becomes the WWF champion. There's still lots of territories. The NWA is still a very bustling organization,
Mhm.
but you start to see, well, pretty much every promotion had their own champion.
Yep.
And so if you were part of the NWA, you could have, your own promotions championship, but there was still just one world champion. Is that fair to say?
Yes. The one world champion that mattered. And then when those territories, where that broke off was when the territories decided one by one to break off from the NWA. And
Mhm.
the world champion was not going to those territories anymore. All of a sudden, it became a television business where Crockett was following where his television went. So he would go to California and they would do business. He would go to Philadelphia, do business. You know what I mean? Instead of that traveling world champion model, it would be Flair versus Dusty here, Flair versus Luger here, Flair versus Sting here. You know what I mean? So it wasn't putting over, it was basically them putting over their own guys. So then it
Yeah.
just became a promotion. So that's where, for example, World Class in 1986 broke off from the NWA in February, and they crowned Rick Rude as their first world champion. So World Class had their own world championship. Memphis, same thing. They worked with the AWA. That was their promotion where they recognized, say your Nick Bockwinkel's as world champion. That relationship went south after the Super Clash thing in 1988. So
Yeah.
therefore, you had Jerry Lawler calling himself the undisputed world champion, wearing the AWA belt, which he still owns, and then Memphis later adopting a version which looked very similar to that belt. But
Yeah.
it was all of a sudden it was the USWA world champion, instead of the USWA Mid South or Mid Southern, sorry, world
Yeah.
champion. Mid South, same thing. When they became Universal Wrestling Federation, it was all of a sudden they went from having a North American title, which was that ginormous belt I showed you a picture of that Magnum TA had,
Yeah.
and many others, Hacksaw Jim Duggan being one of them, and countless others. That was their basically like their United States title would be, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the promotions in the territories, or their regional title. That
Yeah.
was their regional title. And then all of a sudden, when they started getting a little traction with television and they broke off from the NWA, they meaning UWF, it all of a sudden became Universal Wrestling Federation champion, so
It's
slowly but surely the wheels started to go off. And that was when Crockett obtained more power within the NWA, meaning he became the NWA.
yeah.
That all dissolved. So
Is this the early formation of where you start to see secondary championships? Like taking a look at the WWF, you have the Winged Eagle, the world title,
yep.
mostly Hogan, Warrior, Savage, and then you have the Intercontinental Championship that became the Workers' Belt.
Yep.
Did we get to that point from where you were just talking about, that you have the world's champion, but then each promotion has their own regional champion? Is that where we get secondary titles from?
Secondary titles were, and then that's where the secondary titles get moved up into becoming the world championships.
Yeah.
So when they get all of a sudden recognized, and again, WWF was, I mean, think about it. They were not WW. They were still very much Capital Wrestling back in the early stages. And Buddy Rogers was the NWA World Champion at that time. But then when Buddy Rogers and NWA went south, that's when Vince Sr. created his WWF Championship, and he became the first recognized world champion. And then they just had, at that time, the Intercontinental title did not exist. They just had that, and they had the tag belts. That was it. Like, say, your Intercontinental title, which was a fictitious title at first, the tournament in Rio de Janeiro, which never happened. It seemed all tournaments happened in Rio de Janeiro, however.
Yeah.
And Rio does have that big stadium, so it kind of makes sense.
That's a great story to tell.
Yeah, but and before television, you could tell it, but post television, it doesn't make for a good story.
Yeah.
It just makes for a good Wikipedia fun fact, right?
Yeah. But
So,
is that those promotional titles, and then things like the Intercontinental, where I just see like parallels between the regional champions to what we know as today as like secondary titles, even how they're named. There's the world champion, there's the United States champion, the intercontinental champion. And so those cover a broad area, but not world. You have the world championship. And then underneath that, you have, well, and most of them were appropriately named, for regions or huge sections of the globe. And so um, I can see parallels there, but I don't know if that's actually where we got the idea of undertitles.
So, I mean, this is my interpretation of it, right? And we will date back to a couple episodes ago where I was talking about Vern Gagne being uh, basically he was awarded the U.S. championship and was doing the world title schedule because Lou Thesz all of a sudden got some stroke and some power with each title reign, and he didn't want to travel anymore. So he just decided he didn't want to make those dates and he wanted to pick and choose what he wanted to do. So Vern, who was a young guy at the time, was in de facto, and because Vern couldn't get that rematch with Thesz, they each beat each other one apiece, but they never had that rubber match. So
Yeah.
they, as you know, because Lou would not give Vern that rubber match, all of a sudden the NWA promotion creates a United States title and basically gives Vern dates all around the country to go defend this belt that where Lou does not want to defend it. And he's world champion in everything except actually being the world champion. And think about this too. Flash forwarding to the 80s, WWF, now Honky Tonk Man reigns as a good example. Him and Macho Man Savage at the gates, right? Which was a very strong match in the and main evented a lot of those house shows, right? As the main event. Even and that was in de facto because Hogan again can pick and choose his dates, or Vince can pick and choose where he wants to send Hogan.
Yeah.
So okay, so say if they send Hogan to like Chicago, for example, or Boston or Los Angeles, clearly Hogan can't be everywhere. So, in its place, you had as the traveling main event, you had Honky versus Savage on the underneath, right? And they would actually do all the traveling dates, and they would basically send Hogan to all the big cities and get the big money and the big main events. And that's why a lot of those guys worked so hard to be on the Hogan shows, because they
More
knew if
money.
they made an event with Hogan, it would be big money, and it was. That was a big spot. But Hogan wasn't at every major. He did like the really really big major cities, but he did not do every city. That's where the Intercontinental title became the workhorse title, in my opinion. So
For the
in
for
this long,
the B shows.
right, and don't get me wrong, those B shows with that on top was drawing money.
Yeah.
So if you were good enough, like Savage was, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, if he did this well with this, let's see what he does with the world title. And thankfully for Savage, he headlined a lot of the A shows, and there it was. He
Yeah.
did well for himself. But that's a rare case.
Yeah. And I know the WWF back then would have like 3 different shows: an A show, a B show, and even sometimes a C show. And
Yep.
so this what the Intercontinental title was just, well, not just, but a way that they could have a championship title match without needing Hogan to go to every single one.
Right, and usually a C show would be tag. Usually, it would be a world tag team match. So you
Yeah.
had A, B, and C. So all the titles were even treated as such back then.
Yeah.
If you notice, I mean, but Hogan too also would there became a point where he went from being like the hard main event, meaning last match, to all of a sudden he decided to call his shots and say, hey, no, I want to go on third or fourth. So because he wanted to beat everyone back to the hotel, and I don't blame him for that.
Yeah.
They would literally have Hogan go on right before intermission, and then they would have, another match as the main event. It would be either a really hot tag team match or a really hot singles feud that they would have brewing. Not necessarily for the title. Sometimes it would be, depending on if they wanted to pluck the guys from the B shows to the A shows, if they wanted to, like, say, stack the deck. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
typically, those B shows always had a strong, and it would usually be the Intercontinental title would have a strong main event. NWA did not treat that as such. Dusty was more of a load the card kind of guy. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
World title match being the main event, and then United States title, tag title, U.S. title, so on and so forth. NWA had so many titles at
Yeah.
one point, so it was very hard to keep track.
Well, and also when other promotions were incorporated in there and they started to have their own version of the world championship or just their promotional championship, it kind of, would you say that it kind of oversaturated the market? Like a world championship title match was not as prestigious with all of the other championship title matches.
In the territory days, where television was still, now, think of the scope of television back then. TBS Superstation had NWA, WCW. USA Network had WWF, and they were on. WWF was also on in syndication, so they were plugging the television market in two ways. Okay.
Mhm.
TBS, same thing. They had a couple syndicated shows in Worldwide and later Pro, but so that was kind of oversaturation on themselves. But they had also, like, a lot of those small regional territories were just regional to that specific market. It would only cover a couple states.
Yeah.
World class, world class had a strong syndication. In fact, world class at one point had more syndicated stations than both NWA and WCW. Both, because they were syndicated all around the world. They weren't just syndicated here in the United States. They were syndicated all around the world. So
Yeah.
people knew of them that way. So again, it's a case by case basis, but it it became oversaturation due to I would say due to the bigger two, WWF mainly. I
Hmm.
would say, because Vince's goal, and this is why the Black Saturday thing happened. His goal was just to penetrate the market as fast as possible and pluck as many guys as he could from the territory to make his own promotion. So
Yeah. The original world promotion, I would think, with the way he snatched up all the top guys and bought out or ran these other promotions out of town. And
mostly ran him out of town, and that was due to the promoters' egos. You know what I mean? Because Vince made everyone a cash offer,
yeah,
everyone, or made them partners depending on who they were, and some of them just outright refused, and they ended up paying the price because Vince always managed to pluck their best talent and put them on, or WCW would pluck the best talent and they would put them on their shows, and the promotion would just dry up.
money talks.
Oh yes. So
Huh.
yeah.
So now we're getting into our childhood era of wrestling.
Yep.
You you still have the traveling champion with the NWA, but before too long, that's you're just going to have WCW and the WWF. When do you start to see things like the invention of like a TV title? My favorite TV title, like I know ECW had one, but
Mhm.
WCW, I just picture Steven Regal with
Yep.
the little gold belt, and every time he was on TV, he had he could have a little Broadway. You had 15 minutes to beat
Yep.
him and take the title,
Yep.
and that seems to mimic or mock the idea of those old traveling world champion matches that would just go the time limit and you have to try to get them next time. It seems like WCW kind of adopted that and turned the world television title into that.
Yeah, and they had that as early as they were on as early as Mid Atlantic was on television. So we're talking back in the 70s. They had television titles then.
They did?
Where it became a thing was probably the 80s, and it worked a lot like the Intercontinental title, with the exception of there was a couple different rules. You know what I mean? Some old variations, some new variations of some old rules. Meaning, so instead of doing 16 minutes, you did 15 minutes, and sometimes 15 minutes on television. I mean, Christ, if you watch NFL, I mean, 15 minutes on television can be an eternity, like,
Yep.
or any real sport really. But I use the NFL as an example, just due to commercial time and etc. 50, they can really milk out 15 minutes there, but typically same thing. WCW would, but it was by design because you were showcasing uh every time the best wrestler that was on television at the time, and some that stick out, in my opinion, the ones that stuck out the most were probably Arn Anderson. I would have to go at Regal, like you said. Um, Steve Austin as Stunning Steve, who was just getting his feet wet in the wrestling business, but very, very fastly proving that he was every bit as good as the magazines and the dirt sheets and anybody else who would talk was saying. And this was 1991, 1992. And then you would have some veterans who would have it, who would give it a little more credibility, like your Ricky Steamboats, who by the time he would win them later, he was probably in his early 40s by then, but just putting on clinics because Steamboat didn't really need the belt, but he also really had nothing to prove either. He just wanted to go out there and have a good match.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would. I would have to say honestly, the if you're gonna really pick a television champion that was a television champion, I would have to say it would have had to have been Arn Anderson.
Yeah.
Only because Arn wasn't the flashiest guy, but you put a belt on him and you say, "Hey, I'm the best wrestler on television," and he goes out there every week and proves it on television.
Yep.
How can you argue with it?
And I think people like Arn Anderson, um, you know, this is where we're going to start discussing whether or not a championship is a prop or not. But Arn Anderson was so good that he elevated the TV title higher than it was when he got it.
Yeah,
He was like that was a lot of people would be just as happy watching him defend the TV title than they would see Flair defending the world title. Arn was that spectacular.
for his day, yes, he was, and the matches were uh, in Arn's own style, but they were, I would say, just as good, if not sometimes better than Flair's. To be honest,
Yeah, absolutely.
because it really all depended on the opponent Flair was in the ring with too. Because he can only make, what do they say? They can only make chicken salad, chicken shit,
Yeah,
chicken salad or chicken
you
shit.
can't make chicken salad from chicken shit.
Yeah, right. And Flair can only do that so often. And that's where Arn kind of had a slight advantage. And uh in certain cases.
Yeah,
Where the Intercontinental title worked was, if you remember when we were kids, we saw the IC championship defended probably way more than we saw the world title defended on
absolutely.
any given time. They would always throw it up on a random superstars or a Saturday night's main event, or um any random show would have that belt on, or they would show a match on primetime, for example, or Raw. Raw was great for that.
Yeah,
Uh, so the IC belt had more visibility, I felt. So
yeah,
the more so than the world title. The world title And it didn't start becoming a thing where the world title was featured on television as much until Bret Hart won it. And then when Bret won it, because of course his gimmick is I'm the best there is, was, or ever will be. Well, when you say that, you have to go out there and prove it. So that's where you had Bret Hart, where the belt became an attraction belt to a worker's belt
Yeah.
almost. So, and it was almost to where the point where you have Brett as world champion, Shawn as IC champion. It was like, which one's the worker's belt?
Yeah. Yeah. I
The
think both Brett and Shawn, very, very close to each other on a timeline, really did break the mold for what, well, at least in the WWF, what you were used to seeing as a champion. People who look like Warrior, people who look like Hogan, um, Iron Sheik back, man, I could stretch me in half right now at 80 some odd years old. And so the I know that there's been a lot of discussion about, why the business had to transition, a lot to do with steroids and things like that. But I really do think that those two are um, obviously both very good, but are truly exceptional because you are repackaging what a TV wrestler looks like and giving it in a whole new package. You really didn't see guys like them um, in these big title matches, and they had to be exceptional to make that work.
Yeah, and the closest, not at that time, and the closest thing you saw to that, I felt, was probably the late '80s, early '90s when Pillman came on the scene, and Pillman was
Yeah,
at first he was doing the matches with Luger for the United States title, and then Flair wanted to work with him, and Flair made him look like $1 million. And of course, Brian, and actually they wanted to put the belt on Brian. They meaning the committee back then, the championship committee, which was Flair and Jim Ross and a handful of other guys. They felt that confident in Pillman that they wanted to put the world title on him back then. But of course, the powers that be, Jim Hurd and Barnett and others, felt Pillman was too small, and which is a crock of shit because Pillman was very much, he was, he very much had the look. He
yeah,
was ahead of the curve, I think, in
yeah.
terms of what a wrestler should be.
When did we start to see other titles like the light heavyweight championship going into like the Monday Night Wars? There was the cruiserweight title in WCW, but when you had guys like Pillman who came on the scene and those old good old boys club, it's not too good, but we can make another championship just for the little guys. When did we start to see that?
Early '90s, and that all came. I'm not sure if they did that as a favor to Brian, or if like because he was so good in the ring. But you also got to think this was the era they still had Ricky Morton there. They still had Jushin Thunder Liger was just approaching the states at that time. In fact, I think that was his first exposure in the states, was him working with Pillman in WCW. So and they were just having some kick-ass matches for 1992 standard for any standards. But in 1992, it was just mind-blowing to see Liger in the states,
Yeah,
because he to this day one of the more magnificent Japanese wrestlers ever to come out in that cruiserweight form. He just wrestled on NXT probably what I would say 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe,
he
and
did.
yeah, and still looked every bit as good in his 50s than he did in his 20s back then, and
Yeah,
Liger's a guy. He's a great example. He's been there, done that, won every cruiserweight title there had to have been won, both in the States and in Japan,
yeah.
and it just innovated. And probably again, I'm not sure if because this was during a time in that early part of the '90s time period was the era where Dusty came back, and Jim Herd was still in charge, but he wouldn't be for long after that whole Flair dispute with the world title.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it was a Dusty idea. I'm not sure if it was somebody else on the committee, because think about it, Dusty had Mike Graham, Kevin Sullivan, who were not big guys. So and Mike Graham was still an active wrestler at that time at all of 5'9" and 180 pounds. So
Yeah. Well,
not sure, but
and looking at the WCW model for going into like mid to late 90s, Bischoff very wisely was bringing in guys from Mexico through Conan and had a working relationship
yeah.
in Japan. And so just the very high flying and strong style that he was getting from those guys, you still had people that looked kind of typical for like a world champion, and not all of them would be able to have those style of matches. And so I see the cruiserweight title becoming much more prominent, and the WCW television title that Hacksaw found in the trash. The little gold was originally going to be the cruiserweight title, and so it was a design. You have the big gold, and then this is the little gold for the little guys, and that's where I first see in America anyway that cruiserweight or WWF would go on to have the light heavyweight title, which we both saw live for the first time with Takamichi Noku.
You saw it live. I see. I did not. That was the one show I missed in Springfield. Believe it or not.
What?
Drop some news. I went to every show I could in Springfield from '95 to about 2005 time period. I missed one, and it was the DX pay-per-view. So you
Yeah.
got that one over me.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a great show, so I think I don't have any. But you WWF, I don't think has ever known what to do with smaller guys or a light heavyweight title or a cruiserweight title. But with those becoming, well, from my understanding, more prominent in the early to mid 90s, the business is changing with television syndication is a really big factor in all this. When do we start to see other titles? So like WCW had a cruiserweight title, United States title, television title, tag titles, and a world title. Is this where we start to see the beginning of the end for like a title having a lot of prestige that it carried with whoever was the champion? Like the title elevated people, and then there are certain people that elevated the title. Arn Anderson is absolutely one of those people. But you start to see more and more, and you see syndication and shows. When do we kind of start to see that? It's cool, but we'll just take this title and throw it in the trash. When do we kind of start to see the prestige of championships dying out of the mainstream wrestling?
Overexposure due to multiple title changes had something to do with that. Because you had a television show. I mean, somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. So the era of the having television for the purpose of advertisements for the house shows almost became like a dead idea once cable television especially came into play, syndication came into play, where you were it was now instead of, hey, we're advertising this guy versus this guy in this town, it became, hey, on our main event it's so and so versus so and so for the United States title, or so and so and so and so for the world title.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it just became very watered down and very not uh not as prestigious anymore, in my opinion. But going back just a little bit, a little piece, we're talking about the syndication. Well, when NWA bought out Watts in the late '80s, they kept all the UWF champions and brought them into the fold in the NWA. So for the NWA, that's, I think, where it started, because at one point you just had NWA had a lot of belts anyway at that moment in time. You know, you had television, you had tag, you had US, you had world, you had Western States Heritage Champion and Barry Windham. Does anybody know what that is except Barry Windham, right? You had uh what was it? Nelson Royal had he was like a world light heavyweight champion, you know, and
Yeah.
so and you had sometimes you had a women's title, sometimes you didn't, you know. Like there were way too many there were way too many champions at that time, you know, especially in
Yeah.
that 1987 1988 time period. So going forward, uh NWA WCW kind of kept that going. Slowly but surely they were shedding belts over the years. You know, all of a sudden the US tag drops off, all of a sudden the light heavyweight drops off. But then when they realized, they meaning WCW, hey, we have a television promotion to, you know, a television show to run, and we need something, you know,
Mm.
as if all these attractions of the best talent from Japan, the best talent of, you know, Mexico, and all this great US talent and all this great main event talent wasn't enough. Hey, let's add some belts, you
Yeah.
know.
Yep.
So it just by design it was going to get watered down
Yeah.
regardless. WWF, to their credit, stuck the course. You talked about the light heavyweight title being introduced. Now that's not a novel concept. They tried introducing a light heavyweight title, if you remember, back in the late 70s, early 80s. In fact, one of the Dynamite Kid Tiger Mask matches did happen in Madison Square Garden back in 1981, and it was for that WWF Junior Heavyweight
Yeah.
Championship. And a great match, and it still holds up to this day. Not one of their best, in my opinion. Watch any Japanese match. That was probably better than any that match, but for that time in 1981, no, that New York crowd never saw anything like that, you know. And they were trying something, you know, because of course they had the relationship with Japan also. So I think it was it New Japan at the time? I want to say they had the relationship with, yes, because NWA was more all Japan, because it was Flair and Jumbo Saruta would were a lot of those main events.
Mm.
So over on one side, and then on the other side you had New Japan, which was Inoki. So
Yeah.
completely okay, so completely different. Well, I'm digressing again, but I'm saying in this long-winded WWF did stay the course. They created the light heavyweight title, yes. They created the European title right before that, yes. But
Well,
they they
and the
really,
European title was created from all my understanding is to be like what the NXT UK title is today. There were plans back in the 90s to have a championships that would function just like the NXT UK title does today, and then those just kind of fell through. And
well, and creating that belt made absolute sense, and I'll tell you why. Because in the 90s, when WWF was not drawing well in the States, where were they drawing? They were drawing well overseas. Overseas, they were doing record business. That's why they stayed overseas, and that's why a lot of the guys did a lot of overseas tours back then. So creating a European title made absolute sense. Creating it in 1997, I'm not sure how much sense that made. If now, had they created that in 92, 93, right before 94, 95, 96, when they were really traveling over in Europe and just staying for long periods of time, that would have made more sense.
yeah,
But yeah, the idea was there, the concept was there. It's the execution that was not there. Same with the light heavyweight title.
yeah,
But my point being is they stayed the course for a number of years until it became this over bloated thing. And I think where it started, the wheels fell off for them weren't those two titles, but the hardcore title was the start. And the
yeah,
multiple title changes with that. While again, you had a television show to fill, but at the same time, you know, when you have a 32-time hardcore champion, and the guy was only in the promotion for what, a year or two.
Yeah.
Not a very good look.
No, and
So,
then that kind of evolved into the 24/7
yeah,
championship.
and that was the reason why that they had champions that were like 10 times, 20 times, 32
Yeah.
times.
And
And that's oversaturation in itself, you know?
yeah. And when you get to the discussion about whether or not a title is a prop or if it actually means something, um, there are some titles that I believe have purpose, have meaning, have prestige. And then there are one like the 24/7 title is, I mean, if you were ever unsure whether or not the WWE values their titles or their champions, you can see right there, they really don't.
No, not in the
Like,
least.
yeah, back in
However,
the 80s and
however,
90s,
I would say every R-Truth segment, because he was involved in a lot of that stuff,
he's
and
hysterical.
R-Truth tried to make the most out of a bad situation. I'll give him that, because R-Truth himself is a talented guy, and he tried.
He's a national
So
treasure. I love Archer.
yes, he tried. So let's say that to his credit,
Yes,
with the 24/7 title in mind. Yeah, while the concept is junk, R-Truth did try with that belt.
he sure did.
And I felt in the same vein, I felt Crash Holly was a
Yeah,
unsung hero with that hardcore title as well. You know, like he tried making the most out of a bad situation by yeah, and it was because they came up with that 24-hour rule, but you know, he tried making it as entertaining as humanly possible. I mean, the belts like that are definitely props,
yeah,
100%, but
yep,
uh no prestige.
yeah. So
But to the credit of those two wrestlers I just mentioned, they tried.
for sure, yeah. Um, I always hear this discussion usually with one of Conrad's podcast, a lot with Bischoff and Bruce Pritchard, um, where uh, Conrad is, talking from our point of view to these two industry guys. And they're like, it's just a prop. It's just a prop. It's just a prop. And it's like, if it's just a prop and it's always been a prop, why would it really have mattered if Brett showed up on Nitro with that title? Why did you go through with one of the uh, most controversial uh, uh, event in modern wrestling history to get it off him? Like, I think that guys like Pritchard and Bischoff kind of get a sidestep out of having to answer maybe really complicated questions or ones that aren't definitive. They're like, oh yeah, it's just a prop. It doesn't matter. It's all a work. Who cares? Um, when there are people who, like we've talked about, there are people that bring prestige to the titles just by having them, and their work in the ring and their careers are what give those championships meaning. Um, Now it's really hard for me to say that there's a wrestling title that's active right now that isn't just a prop. There are so many. Like, you look at, I mean, WWE, obviously, they have that one with the network logo. It looks really cool, and they just stamp a whole bunch of them out, give them different straps, and say that they're all the same thing. Every title is supposed to be something different, but they all look the same. They all kind of function the same. And kind of segueing into my little rant about the Universal Championship,
Yeah.
when that debuted as a fruit roll up carbon clone of the WWE title, everybody's like, eh. And then you had Bray Wyatt do a magic trick and turn it from red to blue, and titles to today, like Shinsuke Nakamura went like 5 months without defending the Intercontinental title. Like
Yeah.
a legitimate 5 months, and now they're going to unify the WWE and Universal title. In your opinion, is there a way to go back to where these titles have meaning, or put them with guys that can give them meaning and purpose again from where we are now?
It depends on the guy. Now, in saying that, they're trying their and actually, I think are in some ways successful with Roman right now, and in his presentation of having the world title belt and trying to make it as important as humanly possible, along with Roman himself as a character. So
Yeah,
being a main event star, only defending it in the main events, and treating the world title with prestige as such. So I think him having it is a step in the right direction. I, my opinion is we've been so desensitized to look at it like they are props that it's going to take a long time to go back to that mindset to where, hey, this is important and these two are fighting and this is why, you know. um I'm not saying it's not the performer's lack of trying, it's the
yeah.
company's lack of trying, you
It's the
know.
creative fault.
Right. And when we get back to that where they make a world title match seem like, and I mean, I think him and Brock would have been fine without unifying the titles, in my opinion. That's a bona fide main event anywhere, to be
Yeah,
honest. But putting that extra title on there, and unifying it into one, right now it's almost like they have to, because they've depleted the roster so much of guys and girls over the last year or two that what
they're
are you going to
bringing
do?
people out of retirement to do pay-per-views. They had to bring some people out of retirement for both elimination chamber matches, um, matches at the Royal Rumble, and you can see how shallow their roster is. There is not a deep bench for people to really sustain all these championships.
No, and again, it's not the lack of talent. It's
Yeah.
it's the lack of trying and the lack of creative, you know.
Yep.
And I think when you get that creative in place, I think when you get titles that everyone is familiar with and they actually defend and they actually treat with importance, I think then maybe you'll see something different. But um, as far as WWE goes currently in this state, no, it's not. They're props to sell merchandise. On the other side, however, AEW is trying their best with treating the titles with more importance,
Yeah.
and that is a good thing.
Yeah.
And they should treat them with importance, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. There's a I think it's Parts Fun Known YouTube channel. Whenever they do like top 10 lists or quippy little things like that, and they talk about, what's like crazy things that are going on in the WWE. One of their guys is like, WWE is a baby show for babies, and it's kind of a joke, and it's kind of not. Um, and that's where I definitely see stark differences between AEW and uh, WWE. AEW is really shaping up to be my preferred product of wrestling to consume.
what
But
what when I will interject. When I watch them, I don't feel like my intelligence is being completely insulted. Um, I
yeah,
think a lot of them are still winking and nodding to the camera, like saying, "Hey, we're all in on this gag and come join us." But I don't I feel less insulted like watching them as I would a WWE programming. Does that
yeah,
make sense?
it sure does.
Again, not the lack of depth in the roster, because WWE, even with this depleted roster, still has talented guys and girls. I believe it's the lack of creative input is their biggest issue right now, and that they have to get that squared before anything can move forward. In my opinion.
Well, and I think that is also probably the biggest difference between AEW and WWE, kind of rounding out our little sidetrack here. Um, I listened to a panel that had Jim Ross on it, and he talked about the differences between creative and WWE and AEW. And I fully agree that you have television writers who come in and write a very well crafted and entertaining product, but every wrestler just becomes another person giving lines. There's no individuality to their interviews, to their promos. And, back before WWE went public, and what you see in AEW right now is you have people who contribute, but you let the guys go out there, perform their craft, and their personality shapes into something that we can understand and get behind or rally against, depending on if they're a heel or a baby face. And I really just don't see that kind of nuance in WWE anymore.
No, definitely not.
So, personal favorite championships, either in design or function. What do you got?
WWF tag from the Federation years, and that kind of actually stayed until the Attitude Era, even because it went from having the block logo on top to having the scratch logo, and which the New Age Outlaws ended up holding both. And always loved the design of that belt.
Yeah.
Loved it even more when Flair got to use it as a world championship when they took away the actually when he got embroiled in that lawsuit for the with the NWA over the big gold. So always liked and that leads me into the next one, the big gold. Always a favorite of mine. Didn't look too good on a lot of people, with the exception of maybe Flair and Big Show when he was a lot taller and skinnier and had a
Hogan
lot
did
of
okay
hair.
with it, I think.
Hogan? Yeah. Hogan did no. Yeah, it looked good on him too, I think. But I'll always associate that belt with Flair.
Yeah.
Gotta go with the Winged Eagle, of course. Also gotta go because that's just a classically great looking belt. Um, Probably like as far as like an oddball belt, I probably like I would say the probably the UWF belt, only because it was just a center plate design and it just said UWF in big red letters, which later on Ring of Honor adapted as the ROH belt, if you remember.
I do.
Same belt. That's like I was telling you how AEW modeled a lot of their belts after Mid South belts, which I don't
Yeah.
know if that was coincidence or if that was by design, but I was like, man, those look very, very, very similar.
Yeah.
Which leads me into AEW. Their world title is probably my favorite current world title.
Yeah.
I like theirs. TNA's belt, the one that Kurt Angle held in the
Yeah.
2000s, probably
It,
the one that looks like the New Japan belt, or no,
yeah.
sorry, the IWGP belt.
Yeah. Well, he
That
hit them
one,
both at the same time.
yes, and that belt I loved a lot. I thought that was a great looking belt, but again, my opinion. I'd love to hear yours.
I mean, the first one would be the classic Intercontinental belt. I fell in love with that as a kid through Bret Hart. And for me, that belt had a lot more meaning than the Winged Eagle. But as far as aesthetics goes, the classic block logo WWF titles, I actually didn't like the two-tone tag. I liked it when it was all gold, like the ones that the Legion of Doom would end up having that transitioned into the Attitude Era
What about
scratch logo belts.
to interject? What about the silver ones that both the Bulldogs and Brett and Jim had?
Yeah, I wasn't a fan. I don't think that that particular title looked good in silver, and like even the Winged Eagle, like they just released a two-tone version of that. I just don't think that the two-tone works for me anyway in those style of belts.
Now, the white Intercontinental title we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Uh, how you were talking about different colors of the Intercontinental title in episodes past. Now, what's your thoughts and opinions on like different color straps for the IC?
Well, they changed both for Warrior, the Winged Eagle and the IC. I think the yellow is very not good. um,
I never liked it personally myself. On Warrior, it was fine. On I couldn't imagine that on everyone else.
yeah,
Uh,
and I actually saw a custom built on Facebook. Somebody took the oval IC and had a yellow strap like Warriors put on there, and wow, is it ugly. Um, I the only belts I've seen with different color straps that I think worked. I much prefer just a plain black strap and let the metal and the design of the belt uh, uh, kind of speak to that without adding, like, I think it's a gimmick to make different color straps. I think the white IC worked for some people. I think it looked good with Shawn Michaels. Um,
yeah,
with his boy toy looked, I think that looked really good on him.
he had white and he had blue at one point.
Yeah.
And I remember not liking the blue quite as much as I like the white on him.
Yeah.
And the white must be like a go-to. Is my lead in with this is because they've brought the white one back so many times, even as recently as Cody Rhodes,
Yep.
probably what less than 10 years ago, they brought it back
Yep.
and had defended for a while. So there must be something to that white strap because they keep bringing the white strap back.
Yeah. I
So
don't know. See, and I think um, AEW's world title is very ornate and it is very well designed. Um, and I think the latest iteration of the WWE Intercontinental title borrows a lot from the AEW world title. I think there's a lot of influence there. And
I can see that.
yeah, and part of me, like it jumped right out at me. So part of me wants to think uh that was intentional. Like their secondary belt looks a lot like this other promotion's world title. Um, I mean, maybe I'm just connecting dots that aren't there, but I don't know.
Oh, you talk about Cheeky Baby. I'm watching WrestleMania 1 last night. I'm noticing that their world tag team titles that Wyndham and Rotunda had looked a lot like the US title from WCW back in the 80s, like the NWA. Like that silver US title that they had.
Yeah,
The old WWF tag team titles that Wyndham and Rotunda had, and then Sheik and Volkov had, looked just like the United States titles, which also were the 6-man titles in world class.
yeah,
Same design, just give or take a couple of things, but yeah, it's the same overall shape and design of that title belt. Yeah.
yeah. I'd never noticed that. Well, and
Actually, the and go back even further, the Georgia television championship is designed a lot like the old WCW United States title, like so, which is kind of like a secondary 10 pounds of gold there, the original NWA title. It's kind of like a spinoff of that belt.
yeah,
So
I never ever thought the 10 pounds of gold looked good,
or
even
the
a
dome.
little. The dome glow, yeah, that's what I'm meaning. I don't. It it looks really bad. Not saying that it's not important, but I really think that design is just like for me. I don't know.
Yeah, and do you think that's like a generational thing where like we're just used to the flashier looking world titles that actually there was some thought put into it?
I do. I
Eh,
mean, and like they never really changed the design much. I know that there were like some tweaks when TNA was using it for a while, but it just looks like a big black strap. There's like no contouring for the strap into any of the plates. So that one's like you said, I think it's generational and it's just lost on me. It doesn't mean that it's not, important or anything, but um I and maybe this is generational for me too. I liked the ECW tag and TV belts when they were mocking the WWF titles. There was just enough changed, throw some orange in there for Taz, to where it looked good. Their tag titles are just IC belts that were all silver. I think with the big ECW in the middle, I think that worked pretty well. I don't know.
What
Maybe
about
I'm.
Taz's early FTW title, the orange? It said Taz on top. It was a television title, but it was an FTW title.
Yeah,
What,
I mean,
what did you think? What did you think of that one, which was like a spinoff of the Winged Eagle?
yeah, I mean, I was a big fan of that. I was a big mark for Taz back then, anyway. So,
Oh, as was I. I was more curious as to your thoughts on that belt. Not today's FTW title. That one's Brian Cage. The one Brian Cage has is like that's the 1999 one. So after everything, that's when ECW changed all their belts around, and I just not like those designs at all.
yeah, I didn't like the arts and crafts style belt and just like take the men and throw it on there and, oh, look, messy letters and blood. I mean, it was just gawky and stupid. I don't think those look good at all.
Yeah, the however, the when they changed over their ECW world title in 97, the one that Terry Funk and Raven and Sabu had, I
Yeah,
liked that belt and I liked the design of it quite a bit. That was a great belt.
yeah. The ones were like the WWECW style ones, and like the last iteration of the ECW one, the all silver and black, was very boring to me. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but it was boring, and I didn't know what that meant anymore. I don't think WWE knew what that promotion meant either. But
No,
yeah, I
no.
think I think I don't know, I mean, just because it's such a huge part of my childhood, the winged eagle and the classic IC, or whenever I think of a championship belt that has meaning and that um, kind of lives on in me, I think those two styles and those two belts. I also liked WCW's United States title, which is like a distant cousin to the IC title, so that's probably why. Um,
Yeah, both versions actually. The NWA one had some similarities to the Intercontinental title as well.
yeah, those were all Reggie Parks belts, I believe.
Yeah. And if you notice, same style. We just mentioned three different versions of the tag there. Those styles were all Reg Park styles. So, of course they were very similar, but we had no idea.
Yeah,
Your thoughts on the Andre belt?
I think it's cool that they made that. Um, you can, I think that fits in really well for its time period, um, because yeah, we had the Hogan belt that he only held for a little while. Then they made Andre, and then they got the Winged Eagle, if I'm remembering correctly.
With Hogan, see, Hogan's tricky because they had the big green, and then they had the 85 title, which I liked a lot,
Yeah,
that Hogan belt. They also have one in between those belts where it was a humongous looking belt with Hogan's face in the middle.
that's
You
right.
Yeah, you can find that one online. He only wore it a couple times, but they had that. Then the 86 one, which is another favorite of mine, which I
Yeah,
like a lot. That was a great looking belt. Actually, Hogan has that at his beach shop. You can get pictures with it for a nominal fee.
that's
So
awesome.
the real one.
Yeah,
But I the Andre belt, and also side note, that was featured in No Holds Barred in the dressing room scene where Hogan was.
the Andre one.
Yeah, the white Andre belt that had a white strap on it.
Huh?
Yes,
I did not
and
know that.
yes, and also another side note. Later, it was donated to a Planet Hollywood. So,
Hollywood Hogan.
well, Hogan. It was there's a picture of Vince McMahon with it in his hand in an old WWF magazine article. So,
Yeah,
yeah, that white strap, man, they just can't get off it. So, And like I was telling you off air, because we've had the recent passing of Scott Hall,
Yeah.
uh, and they went back to the white strap with him a couple times,
And he
as
and he
well.
pulled it off really well.
Yeah, with that character, it worked, and but the white strap was, and that was only a result, of course, as the clip I showed you. Also, along with that, was he did it for a good cause. He gave away a real intercontinental title to two terminally ill kids on Jerry Springer, and
Yeah.
which at that time they didn't have too many replica belts. They
Yeah.
had belts lying around, but it wasn't like it was at their disposal like it is today. You can't go to the merch stand and get one.
Exactly.
So,
Mm.
it was one of those things. It's
Yeah.
like Knobs giving the belt away, the tag belt away to Willie Nelson at WrestleMania 7. So
Cool.